it suddenly feels like Loki season 2 is going to be incredibly important to the future of the MCU stories moving forward.
If what I saw is true, there's nothing that stands between this world and utter destruction.
Hey guys, it's Sean O'Connell, the managing editor here at Cinema Blend, and we are continuing our analysis of Loki Season 2. We're up to Episode 4, which ended with a spectacular cliffhanger, which we're going to have to discuss immediately. Spoilers for everything going forward, particularly because the TVA just exploded, and honestly, WTF, where are we going from here?
You know that?
Yeah.
You've seen that?
Yeah.
Can you fix that?
No.
It seems like this is going to have massive ramifications for the MCU as a whole, as the mission to save the Time Loom fails. The Time Loom seems to explode beyond itself, and multiverses are spilling all over the place. And the variant that we were following all this time, Victor Timely, who we thought was going to be really important to the story moving forward, turns himself into spaghetti, essentially. Where do we go from here? To make sure you don't miss any of our analysis, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, keep it locked here on Cinema Blend. So, like I said, we got a lot to get to, and we're going to start with some rampant speculation right now.
A little good old-fashioned legwork.
Okay, so as soon as this episode ended, I had to go to all of the trailers to see what other footage Marvel had been showing to fans that were not included in the 4 episodes up to this point. And there's a lot, honestly. There's only 2 episodes left to go, but I want to break down some of the things that we saw, and I'll show you guys some screenshots of them as we're going forward, because I think it's going to indicate where the action is going to take us now that the loom has exploded and the multiverses are going everywhere. The first shot that we see is B-15, and she is walking into a hospital, and she's dressed like she's an employee of the place. And right after that, we see a shot of Casey, who looks like he's someplace rough, like the basement of a warehouse or even kind of like a prison, because he looks a little bit terrified. And I think it's really possible that now that the TVA is exploding and the multiverses are expanding from what it looks like, the TVA agents, or the people who are kind of working with Loki on this, are going to get sent back to their original timelines. There's also a shot that comes out later that has Loki standing in front of a sporting goods facility called Piranha that has 2, you guessed it, jet skis sitting in front of it. If it were my guess, if everybody gets sent back to their places on the timeline, then that's where Loki is going to find Mobius, because he's probably going to have to rally around to get the team back together to save what's left of the TVA. We also see a shot of Ravonna, who has been pruned, and she is now back at the Void at the end of time. She looks like she's seeing something devastating. Maybe it is the monster that was once controlled by He Who Remains, because his corpse is still there. And we see Sylvie somewhere in the TVA. I think it looks like an office at the TVA. It could even be Judge Renslayer's office, but there's this great effect, essentially, of all the threads of objects being pulled apart, sort of turning into the spaghetti that the Victor Timely turned into, which seems to suggest this is what's happening to the TVA, as all the fabric of reality is being decimated and pulled to all ends. So based on these few shots that we see in some of the trailers that exist, I think the people from the TVA are going to get sent back to their different places on the timeline. Loki's going to have to go collect them all again, and Renslayer, she's back in the Void at the end of time, and there is going to be a war coming in which she and Miss Minutes and I guess Brad are going to fight against Loki and his small army to see who controls the TVA by the end of this season.
War is on its way.
All right, let's get to the fact that Loki finally brought itself full circle around to some of the actions that we saw in episode 1. And it also played around with the logistics of time travel in a way that most, time travel stories try to get away with. And it's this whole analogy of a snake eating its own tail. Victor Timely meets OB. OB meets Victor Timely. Victor Timely, that we are meeting at this point now, was given a copy of the TVA guidebook that helped him get to the point where he was at in Chicago on the branched timeline, where he had all of this knowledge of the TVA and he was able to build a prototype of the loom. But the book that Victor Timely was studying from was written by OB, although OB tells him that I learned everything that I know from a scientist from the 18th century, and it's Victor Timely. So you have Victor Timely inspiring OB, who inspires Victor Timely, who inspires OB.
Round, around, and around we go.
The reason why I think that the Marvel can get away with this in Loki, because none of it makes sense. If you put it all on paper, that it just doesn't compute. There's no way that it adds up to something that we could follow. But when you're in the TVA, time operates differently. It doesn't go linear. There essentially all of time kind of exists, and you can jump around from different place to different place. And once we left that sort of branched timeline that the more educated Victor Timely was on and came back to the TVA, everything kind of eliminated, and we're back to the central idea of the sacred timeline. When Loki kind of says to Sylvie, like, I promise all of this is going to make sense. Yeah, we answered the question of who prunes Loki in episode 1. Of course, it's Loki. Amazing head scratcher type stuff that, if you want to sit there and scrutinize every sort of minute of it and be like, okay, but really, how did this, it might not actually work out. But we're in the TVA and time is irrelevant. And so, yes, we're getting a snake eating its own tail, and we're getting Loki pruning Loki. And it's all bringing us to the point where it's going to just fall apart and probably have to be built back up to this point. I love it. I think it's super exhilarating. I'm with it enough that I kind of understand what's going on. I loved when we saw, and I did not pick up on while I was watching it, the fact that it transitioned between episode 1 Loki as he's kind of running around without his jacket on, and then episode 4 Loki, who has to prune episode 1 Loki. Even saying it out loud makes me sound like a lunatic. But in context, it all kind of made sense, and I rolled with it, and I hope you did too.
Yeah.
Finally, there's a big scene in this episode that I want to sort of take the time to go over, because I think it signifies what happened with Ravonna and He Who Remains and their argument in the Citadel at the end of time. We have Loki and Sylvie, who are continuing to have this discussion that's been pretty prominent throughout season 2, which is, should you keep the order of the TVA and prune the different timelines, or should you allow everyone to have free will? And Sylvie is totally opposed to restoring the TVA and allowing them to continue. She wants all the different timelines to have free will and to be able to make their choices. It's something she fought for the entire time. It's why she killed He Who Remains at the end of season 1. Loki is going through an evolution and seems to be supporting the fact that the TVA needs to keep going, because the people who are on their branch timelines would not survive if not for the work of the people in the TVA right now. And yes, maybe free will is important, but Loki says you can't just give people free will and let them sort of go about their way. Well, this is the exact debate that He Who Remains was having with Loki and Sylvie when he was saying to him, hey, I'm tired of doing this. It's time for you two to take over. And they were going to have this discussion. Sylvie and Loki, if they took over the Citadel at the end of time, they would have to continue to have this conversation about, how do we maintain order? Do we leave the TVA going, or do we let the branches of the timeline sort of go in all different directions and let the people have their free will? I think that conversation probably mirrors exactly what Ravonna Renslayer and He Who Remains argued about, probably in the Citadel at the end of time, where Renslayer was probably like, no, people should have free will. They should be able to, we fought this multiversal war. We won. I was the general who led your battle. And now people should be able to go out and do whatever they want to do. And He Who Remains was like, no, I have to basically keep the sacred timeline going. And so I'm going to send you back to the TVA and I'm going to wipe your memory. Like, I really do think that theory that we suggested a couple episodes ago is holding strong. That's all, these theories are still there. So now we're going to get to a war. You see Miss Minutes kind of say vindictively to Victor Timely, you will never be him. Like, she's still on the side of He Who Remains, and she's been loyal to him for eons. And Renslayer was able to convince X5 to come over to her side, but then she was willing to just decimate everybody else who didn't believe in her strategy. So if there's a war that's going to be waged, over control of the TVA, you have Renslayer and Miss Minutes on one side, and you have Loki and what's left of his little army on the other. And I think that's going to take up most of the last 2 episodes of this season.
Everything is turning to
That's right.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we only have 2 episodes left, which seems insane. Like, based on the ending of this episode, it feels like there's so much more that has to happen. First of all, it's just telling us what happens to the TVA. And if the TVA were to fail and the multiverse were to explode out, those are the ramifications that I think we're going to have on the MCU as a whole. We're going to get the Marvels in a couple of weeks, and that's a story that's kind of isolated off to its own little corner of the cosmic galaxy of the MCU. But then when we get into things like Deadpool 3 and maybe the Fantastic Four, and then of course those 2 big Avengers movies that are coming, they are going to have to deal with the ramifications of all the stuff that happens in Loki season 2, which is why you guys need to be back here for our analysis of episodes 5 and 6 as they arrive. We'll be on Cinema Blends YouTube page so that you can hear what we think about the different episodes and what is happening in them and what they mean going forward. So hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and I'll meet you back here next week for our analysis of Loki Season 2, Episode number 5.